Intel is the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer and a major supplier of the microprocessors and memory chips found in most personal computers. Because of its dependence on computer sales, Intel is vulnerable to swings of the business cycle. In recent years, sales of computers have declined because many consumers and businesses switched to using tablets and smartphones to access the internet. In addition, Intel is hurt during recessions. During the last quarter of 2008, Intel's revenues fell 90%, and it laid off 6,000 workers. Intel bounced back in 2010 as the U.S. economy recovered from the 2007 to 2009 recession, but unexpectedly slow growth in U.S. real GDP in 2012 contributed to a decrease in revenue. Intel and other firms experience swings in sales and revenue as a result of fluctuations in total spending, or aggregate expenditure, in our economy. This has ripple effects across the economy, felt in employment levels and the level of consumer spending and expansion or contraction.
Thanks. Pavel Malkinov joining us, Raymond James. Keith McCullough with me. Energy obviously outperforming the broader market. Would you buy energy?
Yes. I like buying inflation. We've liked buying inflation since the beginning of the year. We were bearish on inflation for the 2 years before that. So you have to be a little careful, particularly if the strength in the dollar continues, the weakness in the euro. There's a lot to think about on these trades. But net, being long energy instead of something that's getting jammed like the U.S. consumer is kind of the way that we've been set up.
So in an environment where we see an economy bumping along the bottom, that GDP number, you're not buying it yesterday, 4%.
You don't think the New York Times is going to tell you that 4% GDP is the new number?
Big article about how great the GDP was.
Yeah.
But, it's so volatile. I mean, I don't understand how you go from a 2.9% contraction to 4% growth number.
Well, it's just math. So, again, if you just look at how GDP is reported in terms of the sequentials, as bad as you get was as good as you can look next, which is as bad as you can look after that. So, again, what you get from a netting perspective is an annualized GDP number for the first half of 0.87%. And the street is still out there, and the Fed's out there at 3+% GDP expectations in the back half. So that looks next to mathematically impossible, particularly for the third quarter, which is why I think you get bonds down for a day, yields up for a day. It's just one more buying opportunity in the slow growth trade, which is long bonds.
Don't forget, we also have, 2 more revisions on GDP.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for the first quarter, we started off positive.
Yeah.
We started off with growth, and then we went to contraction.
Yep.
So we could go contraction as well.
And the other big thing to think about is how good GDP was in the third quarter last year. So we're talking about sequential, or the rate of change from bad to good to bad. But if you look at it year over year, last year in the third quarter, 4.18% GDP is a very difficult comparison. Moreover, the inflation number was very, very low. Last year, the deflator was testing a 40-year low. You have to subtract, not to get all, this is real sophisticated math, right?
Yeah.
You subtract inflation from the top line to get a real GDP number. And that's the big paradox of the Fed. There is nothing real about a policy to inflate. There's just a policy to inflate that inflates asset prices, which jams a lot of people and doesn't give you a sustained economic recovery.
All right, we want to
Aggregate expenditure, AE, is total spending in the economy, the sum of consumption, planned investment, government purchases, and net exports. The aggregate expenditure model is a macroeconomic model that focuses on the short-run relationship between total spending and real GDP, assuming that the price level is constant. The key idea of this model is that in any particular year, the level of GDP is determined mainly by the level of aggregate expenditure. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes published The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, a book that analyzed the relationship between changes in aggregate expenditure and changes in GDP. Keynes identified 4 components of aggregate expenditure that together equal GDP: consumption, C; planned investment, I; government purchases, G; net exports, NX. We say it like this: aggregate expenditure equals consumption plus planned investment plus government purchases plus net exports. but we write it with the letters AE equals C plus I plus G plus NX. In this case, AE replaces Y, or GDP, but also note, I now stands for planned investment. This is a difference from what you learned in terms of measuring the GDP. Pay attention to this one. It will serve you well. Inventories are goods that have been produced but not yet sold. For the economy as a whole, we can say that actual investment spending will be greater than planned investment spending when there is an unplanned increase in inventories. Actual investment spending will be less than planned investment spending when there is an unplanned decrease in inventories. Actual investment will equal planned investment only when there is no unplanned change in inventories. For the economy as a whole, macroeconomic equilibrium occurs where aggregate expenditure equals total production, or GDP. Keep your attention focused on the difference between GDP and AE, because the measurement is different only in respect to actual investment in GDP versus planned investment in AE. We will focus on planned investments in the economy as it relates to the business cycle, periods of expansion and contraction. When aggregate expenditure is greater than GDP, inventories will decline, and GDP and total employment will increase. When aggregate expenditure is less than GDP, inventories will increase, and GDP and total employment will decrease. Only when aggregate expenditure equals GDP will firms sell what they expected to sell. In this case, their inventories will be unchanged, and they will not have any incentive to increase or decrease production. The economy will be in macroeconomic equilibrium. When economists forecast that aggregate expenditure is likely to decline, the federal government may implement macroeconomic policies in an attempt to head off the fall in expenditure and keep the economy from falling into recession. Think about Whirlpool, making desirable products, integrating new technologies, and keeping products at the cutting edge of consumer demand. As Whirlpool contacts businesses that sell their retail consumer appliances, they schedule how to plan for big purchase events like Christmas or the start of fall semester at colleges all around the country. Whirlpool is attuned to what retail stores are ordering for their monthly demand. They know when sales are dropping below expected levels and when demand increases. These expected demand levels guide company employment scheduling. When slowdowns are expected, the company can produce within scheduled guidelines. When they are unexpected, it means a slowdown is in effect and layoffs become a reality. Inventory changes are often an important indicator of the near future direction of GDP.
Korea's top economic policymaker is pledged to take a more active role in supporting the job market and people's livelihoods in light of the ongoing economic and political turmoil rattling the country. Shin Se-min tells us what the finance ministry has planned for 2017.
Korea's finance minister has promised to strengthen the government's role in creating jobs and stabilizing livelihood issues.
The government will do all it can to reach the target goal for government spending next year. We're also prepared to implement public projects to boost people's livelihoods as soon as possible.
Speaking at a ministerial level meeting on the economy on Wednesday, Yoo Bil-ho said that all things will be done to ensure next year's budget is ready, so there's no delay in its implementation at the beginning of the year. Yoo added that special teams will be put in place to ensure any delayed government wages will be settled before the end of the year. The finance minister also said he would work to support young Koreans looking to get a job by classifying potential jobs by country and sector. He added that the ministry will also boost the job market in the service sector, starting by improving aviation distribution competitiveness. The Korean economy has currently faced a number of challenges, including faltering exports and slow domestic consumption. That's on top of the ongoing political scandal sparked by the motion to impeach President Park, a variable that's likely to dent foreign investment in the months to come. Yu added that his team is doing its best to ensure such political uncertainties will not hurt the economy, adding that his economic team will remain on high alert to gauge the impact of both internal and external events, including the U.S. Fed's meeting this week. 신세민, 아리랑 뉴스.
There are 4 components of aggregate expenditure. Each component is measured in real terms. Keeping them in real terms puts the comparison out of the influences of changing price levels and inflation's impacts. Consumption is by far the largest component of aggregate expenditure. Take a look at how consumption has changed in respect to recessions in the U.S. economy. When a contraction starts, household spending drops, or at least slows until the expansion restarts. The 5 most important variables that determine the level of consumption are current disposable income, household wealth, expected future income, the price level, and the interest rate. Current disposable income starts with household income, but is affected by savings and investments. As changes in income happen, so does the household's consumption expenditures. Household wealth is determined not only by the income levels and rates of saving, but also by investments and stock and bond value. That makes the positive side of the equation. But from that comes liabilities, like mortgages, student loans, car loans, and similar financial obligations. Expected future income is an interesting situation to affect consumer behavior. But it does make a difference for how people spend their resources, based on what you will make or what you did make. Some people will spend on expectations. I got a new job with a raise in salary, so I'll start spending it now. Maybe even go into debt to afford that new lifestyle, starting right now. Others, like commission-based professionals, will practice consumption smoothing. Consumption smoothing means that part of the income from commissions is held in savings and added to each period, so that when demand drops and commissions are reduced, the saved resources can be used to live on. As a consultant, this is the only way I have been able to survive business cycles as they contracted. Resisting the urge to splurge is important, but sometimes moderate indulgence is good. We have seen different expressions of how the markets react to business cycles, but very often prices rise from year to year. When prices climb and our salaries remain level, we are experiencing a drop in our effective incomes. The immediate impact is a reduction in real consumer spending. Remember The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, and how we were told that people and businesses consider self-interests when making economic choices. By that, when interest rates climb, people will save more interest-bearing money than spend it. They will also borrow less, because the cost of borrowing carries a heavy load to repayment obligations. This impacts durable goods more than non-durables, so your food purchases will likely see only minor adjustments, but your Whirlpool and GMC purchases may be delayed until the economy settles more to your side of the ledger. The consumption function is the relationship between consumption spending and disposable income. The marginal propensity to consume, MPC, is the slope of the consumption function. It is the amount by which consumption spending changes when disposable income changes. Generally, as a country, we have a fairly consistent level of MPC, as each new dollar earned results in a consistent level of consumption spending. This is relatively consistent for the person making $30,000 a year, who then receives a salary increase to $32,500 a year. The MPC will remain relatively consistent with the new salary. More is spent, but as a percent of the total, it remains generally the same. We can write the expression for the MPC as numerator changes in consumption, denominator changes in disposable income. That is, the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. Between 2002 and 2003, as a country, our MPC was about 0.97. Taken literally, it means you earned $32,000 and spent about $31,000 on consumption. Or in steps, your increase in salary by $2,500 resulted in $2,425 additional consumption spending. Consumption spending by households depends on disposable income, but we want to focus on the relationship between consumption spending and GDP. The difference between GDP and national income is small, and in this class it can be ignored. Disposable income is equal to national income plus transfer payments minus taxes. Taxes minus transfer payments are equal to net taxes, so we can write disposable income equals national income minus net taxes. This equation can be rearranged as national income equals GDP equals disposable income plus net taxes. I shared the MPC for the US in 2002 to 2003 as 97%. Now we consider how this is calculated. Look at the leftmost column to see how national income rose by $2,000 billion and consumption rose by $1,500 billion. The MPC maintained the rate of 0.75. National income rose $2,000 billion and consumption went up $1,500 billion. For the economy as a whole, national income equals consumption plus saving plus taxes. When national income increases, there must be a combination of increases in consumption, saving, and taxes. Change in national income equals change in consumption plus change in saving plus change in taxes. Using symbols where Y represents national income and GDP, C represents consumption, S represents savings, and T represents taxes, we can write Y equals C plus S plus T, and the change in Y equals change in C plus change in S plus change in T. We can assume that taxes are always a constant amount, so the following is also true. The change in Y equals the change in C plus the change in S. The marginal propensity to save, MPS, is the amount by which saving changes when disposable income changes. If we divide the previous equation by the change in Y, we get the change in Y divided by the change in Y equals the change in C divided by the change in Y plus the change in S divided by the change in Y. Or 1 equals marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save. This equation tells us that when taxes are constant, the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save must always equal 1. Investment in the U.S. economy is fickle and responds to perceptions as well as measurable accounts of the economy. Look, for instance, at the drop in investment spending as the Great Recession slammed the economy. Today's recovery cycle only recaptured the real gross private domestic investment of $2,774 billion from the first quarter 2006 in the fourth quarter of 2014. That expansion was thwarted in the third quarter 2015 as it again started a downward trend. The four most important variables that determine the level of investment are 1. Expectations of future profitability. 2. The interest rate. 3. Taxes. The federal government imposes a corporate income tax on the profits corporations earn, including profits from the new buildings, equipment, and other investment goods they purchase. A reduction in the corporate income tax increases the after-tax profitability of investment spending. Investment tax incentives also increase investment spending. 4. Cash flow. Cash flow is the difference between the cash revenues received by a firm and the cash spending by the firm. Future profitability expectations are in the category of perceptions by business people as the path to making a profit is considered. When these perceptions are made in the aftermath of a recession, businesses recognize that money has been lost. Resources for new expansion are reduced, and risk-taking is avoided when possible. This is further compromised when the government is challenged to support government programs and seek new funding through increased business taxes. The potential of increased taxes on business success will lead businesses to further limit expansionary efforts. During recessions, few businesses will make investments. Some businesses operate on retained earnings and supplement it with borrowed money. The real interest rate is the clincher for business borrowing decisions. When it rises, businesses will reduce their level of borrowed funds. As we will see soon in this class, monetary policy sets the prime interest rate determined by the U.S. Federal Reserve and is a pivotal interest rate determining the availability of money and interest rate for businesses. Taxes, it has been said, are best when paid by someone else. But in the real world, governments seek money most often through the successes of businesses. Also coming soon in this class, we will talk about how fiscal policies made by the President and Congress can speed or slow the economy through taxation on businesses. Sometimes tax programs encourage investments, and sometimes they penalize businesses for making money. Businesses make money by taking risks, inventing new products and processes, and doing a better job of what they are good at. When they experience success, they can retain some earnings to reinvest in the business. This money, known as profit, is often the most critical component of cash flow to fund operations. It is the driver of business investment spending. Intel knows and feels the impacts of recessions on its business operations. In an effort to insulate the company's dependence on durable good desktop computers, Intel has shifted a portion of its investments into making processors for tablet computers and smartphones. These are considered less durable than desktop computers. They cost less. This has enabled Intel to level out its revenues through business cycles.
With tablets powered by Intel, the essentials are packed. There's no speed limit and plenty of fuel in the tank. It makes a perfect vacation. Experience amazing tablet performance only with Intel inside.
Total government purchases include all spending by federal, state, tribal, and local governments for goods and services. It does not include transfer payments for things like unemployment insurance or Social Security payments. It only includes payments for goods and services the government receives because of the payments. Generally, government expenses increased through time as government organizations took advantage of increases in productivity and technologies adopted by domestic businesses. During the recovery period for the Great Recession, the Obama administration in March 2013 ordered enactment of the sequestration rule, which included a reduction of government spending that sent some government employees away from work and stopped most government contracts executed by private businesses. Net exports equals exports minus imports. The three most important variables that determine the level of net exports are the price level in the United States relative to the price levels in other countries, the growth rate of GDP in the United States relative to the growth rates of GDP in other countries, and the exchange rate between the dollar and other currencies. As consumers, we have generally become less biased against foreign imports today than we were several decades ago. The biggest reason may be the influence of lower prices on imported goods from low-cost providers, such as Mexico and China. This price comparison is derived from comparisons between countries. For instance, if the U.S. price level rises faster than the price level in Mexico, then U.S. net exports will decrease, because U.S. goods become more expensive relative to Mexican goods. Therefore, U.S. imports will rise, and our exports will fall. There is a logic to these interactions, and I recommend you pause the video right here to study these and make that reasoning clear to your understanding of this introduction to international economics. It is fundamental to macroeconomics. Make it yours. Steve Jobs of Apple Incorporated designed the iPhone and made the technology possible. He is the epitome of American entrepreneurs. He is also attuned to the risks of globalization associated with the rule of law. He was attracted to low-cost labor in several countries and the level of technology advanced in some countries. To abate his concerns with lax rule of law enforcement in other countries, Apple decided to distribute iPhone manufacture across several countries. No single manufacturer holds the full design schematic to the iPhone. China was selected as the point of final assembly. So, if China doesn't represent much of the value of manufacturing of the iPhone, what countries do? Japan, South Korea, and Germany. Together, these three countries make up over 63% of the value of the iPhone. These developed economies are masters of advanced manufacturing and have relied on shrewd business practices, along with cutting-edge technologies and smart workforce training programs to sustain their manufacturing sectors. The outcome of which is that they, not us, are adding manufacturing value to what essentially is an American invention. Does that make the iPhone a Chinese export to the USA? Most likely it is not, in the absolute sense of the definition, but for the World Trade Organization, apparently, it is.
In the shops, full employment and low interest rates helped Germany's economy to its strongest growth in 5 years in 2016. There was a 2% increase in consumer spending, while government expenditure increased by 4.2%. The German Statistics Office estimates growth in the Eurozone's largest economy was around 1.9% for all of last year. Rising inflation from higher oil prices is expected to reduce purchasing power this year, however, restraining growth from consumption. Government spending on settling and training refugees could also taper off with fewer arrivals. And economists expect the growth drivers to change with a moderate shift from domestic demand to stronger export activity. However, possible protectionist trade policy by the Trump administration in the US and state interference in China could hurt German exports.
We can use a 45-degree line diagram to illustrate macroeconomic equilibrium. In a graph, the line represents all the points that are equal distances from both axes. Because macroeconomic equilibrium occurs where planned aggregate expenditure equals GDP, We know that all points of macroeconomic equilibrium must lie along the 45-degree line. We assume that the variables that determine planned investment, government purchases, and net exports will all remain constant, as well as the variables other than GDP that affect consumption. Where the aggregate expenditure, AE, line crosses the 45-degree line, planned aggregate expenditure is equal to GDP, and the economy is in macroeconomic equilibrium. Be aware, the Pepsi Corporation does not produce a bottle of Pepsi and hand it to a consumer on the spot manufacturing. They make projections about demand for their products so they can supply it to retailers who will store it at their shops and ultimately sell it to consumers. That process can take weeks, even months, or years to cycle through the process from product initiation to final sales and consumption. This is where the 45-degree line comes into effect. At point B, 8 bottles of Pepsi are produced, x-axis, and 8 bottles are sold, y-axis. We are in equilibrium in the marketplace. Nirvana is achieved and the economy is stable. Now, take a look at point C, where retailers sell 10 bottles of Pepsi, but only 6 were produced by Pepsi. In the marketplace, people increased their demand for Pepsi and bought more bottles, but the company reduced production to 6 bottles. Pepsi's supplies are being depleted, sending a clear signal to the manufacturer to increase production. In contrast, at point D, consumers are buying fewer bottles, yet the company continues with normal production levels, creating a surplus of Pepsi, and as a result, the company will slow production. Considering Pepsi makes for a good example, but to really use this technology, we apply it to the national economy, the GDP. John Maynard Keynes was an English economist whose ideas fundamentally changed the theory and practice of macroeconomics and the economic policies of governments. He lived 1883 through 1946 and influenced government leaders in Europe and America. The Keynesian cross diagram demonstrates the relationship between real aggregate expenditure and real GDP, measured by output. Just as we hypothesized the sales of Pepsi and its production by manufacturer were delayed based on the amount of Pepsi held in reserves between manufacturer and retailer, we can consider aggregate demand and aggregate supply as being buffered by planned aggregate expenditure. When planned AE equals GDP, the national economy is in equilibrium. The importance of this concept is seen when considering how households each treat their income based on what is happening in the economy. When we combine all the households in the nation, we call it aggregate household income. Taken one household at a time, your household, think about new income you receive. What do you do with it? Some of it gets spent and some of it gets saved. Your rate of spending that new income is expressed through your personal marginal propensity to spend. Combined with all the other households in the country, you have an aggregate expenditure rate for the GDP as consumption, C. As an aggregate number, it fits into our nexus of macroeconomics in the form of the GDP formula. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Seriously, I told you this would keep coming up. Equilibrium, as expressed with the Keynesian cross, means that the left side equals the right side. We believe the Keynesian cross line represents equilibrium in the economy, so we insert actual measurements of the economy to see where the economy resides currently. We might like to be in equilibrium, but really we are generally a little out of whack, and sometimes a lot out of whack. The blue line shows current consumption in the economy. It is not a perfectly 45-degree arc, but it does intersect the Keynesian cross line. The Keynesian cross diagram, or 45-degree line diagram, shows a desired total spending, or aggregate expenditure, also called aggregate demand curve. Current expenditures, shown in blue, is drawn as a rising line since consumers will have a larger demand with a rise in disposable income, which increases the total national output. Understand, this blue line represents only aggregate consumption, C. We go back to our GDP formula to add planned investments. Next, government spending. Finally, net exports. Here, NX is shown as an increase for simplicity on this diagram, but currently we know that NX is a negative number in the USA, so it would actually show as a lowering of this combination of lines. For now, we show it as a positive factor for simplicity. Equilibrium in this diagram occurs where aggregate demand, AD, equals the total amount of national output, Y, which corresponds to the total national income or production. Here, total demand equals total supply. We are at equilibrium, $10 trillion, all in. We call this the aggregate expenditure function. Next, we start to fiddle with it, put it out of balance. We do this because we know the economy is not always in balance. Recent memory tells us this started in the 2007 to 2009 US recession, and it is still out of whack, seeking that elusive equilibrium balance. We consider what would happen if instead of $10 trillion AE, we were at $9 trillion AE. This is an unplanned decrease in inventories held by businesses. It might be Pepsi bottles and American-made automobiles, softwood lumber supplies, and everything else made in the USA known as aggregate supplies. This unplanned decrease in inventories results in businesses stepping up their production to move from the $8 trillion in real GDP to $10 trillion, where equilibrium is found. On the other side, what if AE was found at $11 trillion? It would be seen as an unplanned increase in inventories. Businesses are making more than what the market will bear, so businesses will decrease their production so consumers will catch up with their ready-made products. Businesses will slow production, often seen as employees who are laid off. It does cause the economy to slow down, but overall, equilibrium is again achieved at $10 trillion. Equilibrium can be a finicky balance. It is this way because that balance keeps the economy growing at a steady pace. The natural rate of unemployment, about 5% in our economy, is maintained while businesses expand and grow at a predictable rate. When AE is lowered or lapses into a shortfall, the result is a recession. Here we see how the economy slows from the $10 trillion real GDP down the 45-degree line to $9.8 trillion, where equilibrium is seen at $9.8 trillion real AE. The economy has slowed, and we see something very obvious that is off this graph. Unemployment increases. Whenever planned aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP, some firms will experience an unplanned increase in inventories. If firms accumulate excess inventories, then, even if spending quickly returns to its normal levels, firms will have to sell these excess inventories before they can return to producing at normal levels. They return to these normal levels by hiring workers who were laid off in the preceding recession. It takes time to return to full equilibrium. Sometimes, a lot of time. In forecasting real GDP, economists rely on quantitative models of the economy. This table shows several hypothetical combinations of real GDP and planned aggregate expenditure. Macroeconomic equilibrium occurs when the sum of consumption, planned investment, government purchases, and net exports equals GDP. On either side of this level, above or below it, GDP will be increasing or decreasing. $10 trillion is used as an example here, but the actual level is influenced by the price level, inflation, and a host of other factors. Autonomous means self-governing, independent, subject to its own laws only. In economics, autonomous expenditure is an expenditure that does not depend on the level of GDP. In the aggregate expenditure model, planned investment spending, government spending, and net exports are all considered to be autonomous expenditures in respect to AE. Consumption has an autonomous component and an induced component. That is, a component that does depend on the level of GDP. An increase in planned investment spending has a multiplier effect on equilibrium real GDP. Any increase in autonomous expenditure will shift up the aggregate expenditure function and lead to a multiplied increase in equilibrium real GDP. This produces the upward sloping AE line. When AE increases, the line showing it is boosted upward. The movement from A to B, in this example, is seen as an increase of $100 billion planned investment and resulted in a $400 billion increase in equilibrium real GDP. This is the multiplier effect. I urge you to spend mental energy to really understand this term and how it is seen in the economy. The multiplier effect is at the core of this chapter. And in macroeconomics, several effects are hinged on this concept. Let's see how it works. Make sure you can describe it clearly. Businesses make autonomous expenditures of $100 billion. Let's say Whirlpool increases spending on manufacturing to increase their production. There are no additional induced expenditures, so the total GDP impact is $100 billion. Because of the initial movement forward, real GDP increases, and other firms respond by increasing their production level. Not by as much as Whirlpool did, they do it by $75 billion. Now, the total additional GDP is $175 billion. Round 3 happens, as other businesses participate in the additional autonomous expenditure role to increase their spending, but again, not by as much as the previous level. In this case, it is $56 billion. The new total is $231 billion. And on it goes, as each subsequent round is less than the round before it. Take it down to the nth round, where the multiplier effect totals at $400 billion. This all started with an autonomous expenditure of $100 billion, ultimately resulting in the $400 billion total additional expenditure. The multiplier effect is a real thing. For another explanation of the multiplier effect, watch video on this topic. Mr. Clifford explains it with energy and
right now, it's time to go over one of the most important concepts in your macroeconomics class, something called the multiplier effect. The multiplier effect. The multiplier effect. The multiplier effect. Is this ever going to end? Is this ever going to end? Seriously, stop!
The time it takes to realize the full impact of the multiplier effect is undetermined. It can happen rapidly when the economy is moving along nicely, or it can take months, even years, to complete the cycle when the economy is slow to recover from a recession. Mathematically, we look to the change in GDP divided by the change in investment spending to realize the actual multiplier effect. In this case, it was 4. Simply put, it is the amount each dollar spent as planned investments is multiplied by to see the result on equilibrium real GDP. The multiplier is the increase in equilibrium real GDP divided by the increase in autonomous expenditure. The multiplier effect is the process by which an increase in autonomous expenditure leads to a larger increase in real GDP. As economists, we like to explain concepts in a positive sense, that is, in terms of recovery. But the negative perception is also a reality. Take, for example, the Great Depression of the 1930s. In 1929, the stock market made a substantial dive, dropping value across the board. That drop in wealth by households and companies led to a decrease in aggregate expenditure by companies. People lost their jobs. Businesses closed. consumption dropped to very low levels, and real GDP tanked. Consumption, investment, exports, and government spending all were reduced substantially as unemployment skyrocketed. It is the realization of the negative side of the multiplier effect. Another autonomous event happened, starting in Europe in the form of World War II. Initially, it involved U.S. manufacturing of armaments for sale to Allied forces, but then escalated to our involvement after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941. Did World War II save the USA from the fallout of the Great Depression? That would be a crass definition of the results of World War II, but it certainly helped the U.S. economy form a financial recovery path. Can we say that the multiplier effect is always 4? Not really. We need to know how to articulate its true impacts. This is a bit of the tinkering with the numbers to see how to figure it out. We consider a series of mathematical reductions, with each next step diminishing from the previous. We use the marginal propensity to consume and the initial autonomous expenditure amount. In this example, it is $100 billion. MPC times MPC is MPC squared times $100 billion. Each next step adds an exponent value from squared to cubed to quadru to quintic, and so forth. These are compressed into a simplified expression for the change in GDP. Factor out the $100 billion so we can apply any autonomous expenditure we consider. Since we know MPC is less than 1, the multiplier becomes 1 over 1 minus MPC. There are 4 key points about the multiplier effect. First, the multiplier effect occurs both when autonomous expenditure increases and when it decreases. Second, the multiplier effect makes the economy more sensitive to changes in autonomous expenditure than it would otherwise be. Third, the larger the MPC, the larger the value of the multiplier. And 4, the formula for the multiplier is oversimplified because it ignores real-world complications, such as the effect that increasing GDP can have on imports, inflation, interest rates, and individual income taxes. We consider it here to give you a basis for understanding how it all comes together. We can tweak the limiting assumptions, but we have time for that after we know the basis for it. In the short run, if households save more of their income and spend less of it, aggregate expenditure and real GDP will decline. John Maynard Keynes argued that if many households decide at the same time to increase their saving and reduce their spending, they make themselves worse off by causing aggregate expenditure to fall, thereby pushing the economy into a recession. The lower incomes in the recession might mean that total saving does not increase, despite the attempts by many individuals to increase their saving. Keynes referred to this outcome as the paradox of thrift. From my perspective, as an economist, a college professor, a businessman, and a father dedicated to his grandchildren, I feel the paradox of thrift firsthand. We have discussed how people will save more of their money during a recession as opposed to spending it, or going into debt when the economy is constricting. This is a feature of the paradox of thrift, as our entire economy feels the contractions lingering after the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession. When studying demand and supply, you learn that a price change is considered the most important determinant of the quantity demanded for a good or service. It may seem odd that in discussing the determinants of total spending or aggregate expenditure, most important determinant of consumption is the current disposable income of households. If changes in price are important determinants of consumption in individual markets, why aren't they important in determining total consumption expenditures? The key to answering this question is to understand the difference between a relative price change and a change in the price level, or the average of all prices. In microeconomics, a change in the price of a good or service is a relative price change. For example, the price of bottled water falls, prices of all other goods and services do not change. Because bottled water becomes less expensive compared to other items, the quantity demanded of water will increase. In macroeconomics, the focus is not on changes in prices and quantities in individual markets, but changes in the economy as a whole. When there is a change in the price level, this does not refer to a change in one market, instead, in all markets. An increase in the price level of 10% means there is no change in the relative price of bottled water because all other prices have increased by 10% as well. But if current disposable income were to increase by 10%, then consumers have more income to spend on all goods and services. Economists consider this type of change to be most important in determining consumption. I simplify the concepts so you have the ability to gain understanding of the process. In the real world, our actions influence how others react. When a company makes an unexpected aggregate expenditure outlay in our economy, it has an impact. Take, for instance, Schweitzer Engineering of Pullman, Washington, building a new assembly operation in Lewiston, Idaho. They used a government grant to make it, but when they did it, their influence was seen. It meant, for Lewiston, new assembler jobs. It meant increased economic activities in the community, and consumer spending increased. When folks spend their new earnings, consumption increased. That increased spending is also seen in prices. They went up as well. Does it push back? Sure it does. The increased price level will cause aggregate expenditure to fall. Businesses will reduce spending because of the increased costs of spending. This causes the price level to drop. On and on it goes until ultimately equilibrium is reached. We expect that an increase or decrease in aggregate expenditure would affect both real GDP and the price level. There are 3 reasons why there is an inverse relationship between the changes in price level and changes in aggregate expenditure. A rising price level decreases consumption by decreasing the real value of household wealth. A falling price level has the reverse effect. If the price level in the United States rises relative to the price levels in other countries, U.S. exports will become relatively more expensive, and foreign imports will become relatively less expensive, causing net exports to fall. A falling price level in the United States will have the reverse effect. When prices rise, firms and households need more money to finance buying and selling. If the money supply does not increase, the result will be an increase in the interest rate. A higher interest rate will reduce investment spending. A falling price level has the reverse effect. The aggregate demand, AD curve, is a curve that shows the relationship between the price level and the level of planned aggregate expenditure in the economy, holding constant all other factors that affect aggregate expenditure. Consider this now familiar 45-degree line to see the effects of a change in the price level. If the price level increases, businesses will decrease their aggregate expenditures and real GDP will drop. Conversely, a decrease in the price level will result in business aggregate expenditures increasing and the resultant real GDP to increase. This finally links these systems back to the basics of economics, deriving a demand curve. Graph this as the price level on the y-axis and real GDP on the x. As the price level drops, the amount of GDP demanded increases. Think of this by considering who demands gross domestic product. It is obvious. We as a nation demand GDP, and our demand is hinged on the price level. keep increasing the price level, and eventually we all have to take a pass on our demand for GDP. Lower the price level, and we all seem to want more. It is a downward to the right sloping curve.